Chapter 6, the Muscular System, Screencast 3. We are now going to leave the realm of microscopic and actually focus on muscle cells and whole muscle. So we really are shifting gears here. Now, a couple of things we want to keep in mind here. Really important terminology that we need to introduce. Now, the majority of contractions that we see, and remember we're talking about whole muscle now, are isotonic. And what that means, muscle will shorten while maintaining a constant force, and the result is movement. Isometric contractions, we're now talking about the generation of force, but there's no visible shortening and no movement. Really important distinction between the two, and you want to make sure that you're comfortable identifying the difference. Now, other real important terms that we need to know are motor unit, muscle tension, the Euler-Nunn principle, muscle tone, and recruitment. Now, we're going to address each of these new terms as we move on. Now, a motor unit, this is a very, very important definition, and this actually allows us to increase force production in whole muscle. A motor unit is defined as a motor neuron, so a single motor neuron, and all the muscle cells it controls. This is actually the smallest functional unit of whole muscle contraction, okay? Not muscle fibers, whole muscle. So that's really important to keep that in mind. Muscle tension, we'll use this term to describe the mechanical force that's generated by muscle when it contracts. Now, this is going to be determined by three things: the size of the motor unit, how many motor units are active, and the frequency of stimulation of motor units. So together, these are going to determine how much force is actually being produced. Now, the Euler-Nunn principle, what this says, an individual muscle cell contracts or it doesn't. That's important, okay? Because whole muscle does not follow the Euler-Nunn principle. For example, if whole muscle did follow the Euler-Nunn principle, that would mean every time I did anything requiring muscular force, it was maximal force production. So no ability to control force at all, and we know that's not the case. So Euler-Nunn principle applies to individual muscle fibers. They contract or they don't. Now, muscle tone, this is something we see within whole muscle, and basically at a resting state, there are always some muscle fibers contracting, and that's what results in tone. Now, recruitment, this is actually the addition of additional motor units, and this is how we increase the production of force in whole muscle. Now, here, a couple of things that we're looking at. A motor unit, once again, is a motor neuron and the muscle fibers that are innervated or activated by that motor neuron. Now, size is important when we talk about the size of a motor unit, and that refers to how many muscle fibers there are in a particular motor unit. Having said that, a small motor unit does not have a lot of muscle fibers, but it's not going to produce a lot of force either. But it will produce force that we can control. Now, a large motor unit, that's different. That is going to produce a large amount of force because there's lots of muscle fibers associated with that single motor neuron. The issue here is the force is so great, it's going to be very difficult to really control that force production. So that's a very important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about motor units. Now, if we look at the degree that a nerve will actually influence force, we need to look at these terms. A complete cycle of contraction relaxation in response to a stimulus. Now, we're going to be looking in just a second at what we refer to as a myogram. And this is how we actually measure force production of a single fiber. Now, these terms here are also going to be important. The latent period, contraction, relaxation, summation, and tetanic contraction. So let's take a look here. Okay. Now the latent period, notice this is the amount of time it takes from the beginning of the stimulus to force production. So we refer to that as the latent period. So keep in mind no force is being produced during this phase. Now here, we're looking at contraction. This is the period of time in which force is actually produced. Now, we're actually going to look at the relaxation phase. Now, keep in mind, this is a single twitch or a single cycle of a muscle fiber contraction. Now, we're going to look at what happens if we increase the frequency. So now what we're doing is actually stimulating this muscle multiple times. And things I want you to notice. Okay, so here we have summation, and notice something really important here. Okay, we never get back to zero force production. So I stimulated, stimulated again, a little bit more force production, again, and again. And I get to the point where I am continually increasing the frequency of stimulus. And look at this, there's a constant force production. Now, this is the rate at which our motor neurons actually fire. So this here, what this graph is showing is a graph associated with the external stimulation of a single muscle fiber. Now, this is where our motor neurons actually fire at. And this is the force that we produce, and this is a constant force production. Now, another thing that's going to be important is we have different types of muscle fibers. We describe them as either slow twitch versus fast twitch. So this is something that you're going to need to be able to differentiate between the two of and actually provide examples of them. Now, they are opposites if we really look at this. So slow twitch, this is where the name comes from. They contract slowly. Now, an important distinction here is how they actually generate ATP. Slow twitch fibers are going to generate ATP aerobically. Now, because of this, we're going to see lots of mitochondria, very well supplied with blood vessels, and that should make sense because once again, that blood supply is going to bring nutrients to this working muscle and oxygen. They don't store a lot of glycogen. Okay? We can actually think of this as red muscle, or as we're approaching Thanksgiving, let's think of this as dark meat. Okay? This is the type of fiber that is primarily used for endurance activities. Now, the opposite are going to be fast twitch fibers. So unsurprisingly, they contract very quickly. They break down ATP very rapidly. Not a lot of mitochondria. Little or no blood vessels. They store a lot of glycogen. Now, this is known as white muscle, or let's think of this as white meat in our turkey. Now, what we're seeing here, they're primarily producing ATP anaerobically. Now, fast twitch fibers can be used for brief, intense activities. Now, this is determined genetically, okay? If you look at individuals, you can't change the type of muscle fibers that you have. You're kind of stuck with it, okay? So that's important. But here we can actually see what may result in certain types of athletes running in a family, okay? Because of the genetic component. Those individuals that are especially good at endurance activities have a high percentage of slow twitch fibers. Those individuals that excel at sprint type activities, they actually have a higher percentage of fast twitch fibers. Now, most people have a pretty much an equal amount of both. Okay? And once again, this is genetically determined. Okay? One of the things I like to say, this is dependent upon how well you pick your parents. Now, when we look at different types of training, I'm going to refer to training in two different ways. We have strength training, and then we have aerobic training. Now, strength training, this is achieved through resistance training or weight training. Okay? Overall, this is a type of training that's short and very intense. Now, what this is going to do is actually build more myofibrils. And because of this, what we're going to see primarily here is, for the most part, this muscle will hypertrophy and get larger. Now, this happens mostly in fast twitch fibers, so they are more responsive to resistance training. Aerobic training, on the other hand, this is how we build endurance. things that are going to happen in response to aerobic training are going to be an increase in blood supply to muscle cells. We're going to see more mitochondria, more myoglobin. This is a pigment specific to muscle that's very good at transporting oxygen. And to achieve this, you may have heard of having kind of like an exercise prescription. You want to be working at what's known as your target heart rate zone for about 20 minutes at a time at a minimum of 3 times per week. This is how you're going to increase your aerobic conditioning or aerobic training.